All right, hello and welcome to our video. Today we're going to look at the sin of Sodom. And this is going to be a multi-part series because the goal here is for each of us afterwards to be really heavily armed as someone comes at us and is trying to use the Bible as a weapon. And so we're looking at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We see a lot of times people are just sort of like coming at us, and it's this claim that God destroyed Sodom because its inhabitants were all gay men. And that's not what they say, but that's pretty much what it all boils down to as to why God destroyed Sodom. Homosexuality, the sin of homosexuality. And we're going to look at a response to that. And the Bible never says that homosexuality was the sin of Sodom. The context of the particular story makes clear that the central theme is the importance of hospitality to strangers. And then elsewhere in the Bible, the sins of Sodom are listed as pride, excess of food and prosperous ease, and failure to aid the poor and needy. And that's in Ezekiel 16:49, or prostitution and lust for strange flesh, which we see in Jude 7. The principal passage for the clobber verse part of the Sodom and Gomorrah story is Genesis 19, verses 1 through 11. And I'm going to go ahead and read that for us today. But we're not going to spend as much time talking about that particular passage as we are looking at Sodom in its broader context. We'll start out when we first see Sodom several chapters earlier in Genesis. And we're going to go through and really look at a couple of the passages where Sodom's mentioned before this and give the context for this particular story. And then we're going to also then move past that over the next several weeks and look at where Sodom is referred to in other parts of the Old Testament, in the Apocrypha, and then also in the New Testament passages. So I'll go ahead and read this. Genesis 19, verses 1 through 11. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But Lot urged them strongly. So the angels turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But the men in the town replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge? Now we will deal with you worse than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. So when we look at this story, there's a lot of things that kind of stick out for us. And, we start out and the men are just going to stay in that square, but Lot refuses to allow them to do so. He extends hospitality to them. And the story makes a good deal about the type of hospitality. He brought them into his house. He made them a feast. He baked bread and they ate. And then we see the men of the city come out and they call out to Lot and they say, "Bring them out to us so that we may know them." In a couple of weeks, we'll look at more particular about that particular language and what that means. And most people believe that that does mean that the men wanted to have the angels come out and rape them. So Lot, and this is a very difficult part of this passage, says, don't do that. Let me give you my virgin daughters instead. And we're going to have to look at the oddity of this particular transaction where Lot is offering his daughters in protection of these men. And this obviously goes to and speaks a lot about his hospitality culture and also how women were treated as property. So as far as Lot was concerned, he was just offering, he was going to lose some value because his daughters would no longer be virgins, but it was an economic exchange. And that was something that he was willing to pay that price so that he could protect these men who were under this roof and protect this hospitality. And then we're going to look at the blindness, that the angel struck the men with blindness and exactly what that means. And ultimately, we're going to come back at the end of discussing this for several weeks. And I'm going to give you sort of my querying of the story and how I think that the LGBTQ people are actually the angels in the story and not the men in the town. But before we really dive deep into this passage, I think it's more important that we set out some context. What was Sodom? What do we know about Sodom from reading the rest of the scripture? So other Old Testament mentions of Sodom, we see in Genesis 13, 10 through 13. And this is Lot and Abram. This is before Abram, goes by Abraham. And so Abraham and his nephew Lot were in Egypt, and they leave Egypt and they come to the land of the Canaanites, and they decide to separate, and Lot chooses to settle near Sodom because the land was very fertile and looked really good. There was a lot of water. In Genesis 14, we have an interesting story about Abram rescuing his nephew Lot from capture. And this is when Lot was fighting on behalf of the king of Sodom. And there's an exchange between Abram and the king of Sodom in that story. Then we're going to look at Genesis 18 and Abraham's bargain with God to save Sodom from destruction. And then we'll also just sort of mention other references in the Old Testament to the destroyed city, and that's in Deuteronomy 29:23 and 32:32. That's just Sodom is used as an example of a destroyed city. And then we'll spend some time looking at the prophets, and Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, and Zephaniah all mention Sodom. And we'll focus a lot on what Isaiah and Ezekiel have to say. And the apocryphal mentions, the apocryphal are books of the Bible that were part of the church's Bible for 1500 years until Martin Luther came along and then decided that there were certain verses that didn't have a place. So in our Protestant Bible, we don't have the apocryphal works, but they have traditionally been in the church's Bible for a long time and are still in the Bible of Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. So we'll look in 3 Maccabees 2:5. We'll look in 2nd Esdras, and there's 2 references in 2nd Esdras to Sodom. And then the New Testament mentions of Sodom. And here we start out with the Gospels. Jesus refers to the destruction of Sodom in both Matthew and Luke. In Romans 9:29, we see sort of a reference again to Sodom and its destruction. And it seems to be a consistent metaphor that people like to use in the Bible is when they're talking about just a significant destruction where everything was wiped out. They use Sodom as that data point. And we see that in Romans 9:29, 2 Peter 2:6, and then Jude 7. This is one of the verses that is a sort of separate clobber verse, and it mentions Sodom. And it talks about Sodom, the folks in Sodom indulged in sexual immorality. And we're going to look particularly at the Greek word that's used in Jude 7 that gets translated as indulged in sexual immorality, and look at its connection really to prostitution. The origin of that word actually comes from the Greek word that means to sell. We're going to look at that in a week. And then there's a mention in Revelation 11:8. And again, it's not really clear, but it's their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that's prophetically called Sodom and Egypt. So we're not going to spend much time on those types of verses, but they are worth a mention. And so that is going to be our sort of roadmap for how we're going to start to look at all of the biblical references. And of what I've mentioned, there's 51 biblical references to Sodom. So that when we come away from here, we'll be well equipped when someone wants to throw the Sodom and Gomorrah story. We can look at it in its full context and how it's used throughout the Bible. And I think that'll be really useful as we sort of proceed. And we're going to take a similar tact with regards to other of these clobber verses.